that end up with conflicts, they can view it at their leisure. So I'm happy to introduce Narendra Mangra. Narendra is a principal at Globenet. He provides advisory consulting services in all kinds of industries, including government and academia. He's got a lot of diverse experience planning network and system deployments, enterprise modernization, and helps educate people. He's a adjunct professor at George Mason University and co-chairs several IEEE initiatives, including Future Networks, Inger Applications and Services, and the working group P1950.1, Smart City Architecture Standards Development and Public Safety Technology Initiative. He's very interested in transdisciplinary frameworks, 5G and future networks, and is going to share with us this morning. So let me turn it over to Narendra.
Thank you, Don, and thank you for the opportunity to present with your group and discussing as far as the transdisciplinary framework is concerned. And we will get shortly. I'm trying to share the screen at this point. Hopefully you could see it. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes, we see it. Perfect.
Okay, thank you. All right. So today, actually, we are going to be discussing as far as the transdisciplinary framework and really talk a bit about what it is and how it can be used for smart cities and rural development alike. And if you have any questions as we go through, please feel free to ask them along the way. Today, we are going to explain a bit about the transdisciplinary framework, the roots, and some of the scenarios and use cases, and then a little bit more detail in smart cities and rural development. So just to give you a background as far as the transdisciplinary framework is concerned, it actually originated with the INGR, or the International Networks Generations Roadmap. Essentially, that is a group that is focused on technology roadmaps, and there's a number of different chapters, as you can see on the right-hand side. So they are very diverse. The one that we are going to be focusing on is the Applications and Services chapter that really gets into the details of the transdisciplinary framework, and some of the examples and follow-on activities are actually works that originated from Applications and Services. So if you're interested in the chapter to download at a later time, this is the link. So we can get started as far as the transdisciplinary framework. So the first question might be, why transdisciplinary? What are some of the benefits and why do we want to go that way? So there are many ways to look at a particular problem, and the ones that we're most familiar with is really more of looking at it from your particular vantage point or disciplinary background that you may have. And that may be coming in as individuals from a multidisciplinary framework. Whereas we've also made some inroads as far as being able to collaborate among different groups and be able to look at this from an interdisciplinary framework where we can look at it from other perspectives. But essentially, we're creating a separate work, and there are some commonalities, there are some levels of integration, but it's not quite to the fullest level that we can look at to be able to truly solve complex problems that require a more unified framework. So that's really the idea behind the transdisciplinary approach. It's to provide a very high level of integration. So the one that we are going to be looking at is a framework that aligns ecosystems. So if you have a background in business, that may be an approach that you may want to start to be able to engage. If you have a technology background, certainly the networking area of focus would be something for you. And if you have a background in governance, we can go straight to that particular area. The whole point of the transdisciplinary framework is really to engage and to have more collaboration among the different stakeholders. So part of the challenge is if we have complex problems, and you will see sure enough that rural development and smart cities alike are very complex scenarios. we want to be able to break it up into a way we take action. How we frame a particular problem determines how successful we are going to be able to at least try to address what that problem is, and hopefully identify some of the cases that needs to be solved and develop any successful solutions for it. So the challenge for it is to look at a particular ecosystem, and we want to be able to contextualize our applications and services. So for example, a drone by itself could have many functions, right? It could be used for delivery of food, and that in that case, it may be transportation related. Public safety may be for situational awareness, so after a disaster, and as a communications device for a deployable cell site. So it's important to contextualize the solution that we're looking for. And that's really where we look at it from an ecosystems point of view. So take, for example, healthcare. If we define healthcare as the providing continuum of care for healthcare services across the board, from birth to end of life care. So how we structure that may be in the case, for example, in remote service monitoring, whether we're looking at clinics or private practices, basically small practices, or a larger facility such as a hospital, and that ambulance may be part of the connectivity part between where you happen to be and that hospital facility. And of course, we're going in more towards long-term care, whether we're looking at rehabilitation centers or home assisted living. So breaking it up, there's many ways to break this up. And from a business background, you can certainly look at it from each individual industry, depending how you look at it, how you want to do it. But the trick here is we're looking to define this from a transdisciplinary approach. So we want to be able to structure it so that we can take action, at least from a networks and governance perspective as well. So we break it up into about 5 different stages, and they're kind of loosely based on on a supply chain aspect. So we're looking at this from a remote service monitoring or remote monitoring services. And that is really more interested in wide area coverage. We're not necessarily looking for robust capabilities, but we are looking to cover as many people as possible. So that's from one extreme, where we go towards the middle, where we're looking at hospitals, and we're looking more for a robust and integrated types of capabilities. So think of that as where you'll require the best of your high-speed connectivities and your low latency communication capabilities to be able to address more focused care. And of course, towards the end, we're looking more towards customization or mass customization, if you will. So by breaking it up into these areas, now we can take action from a networking perspective, and then subsequently look at it from governance, where we can have different alignments. So from a networking point of view, if we're able to break that up, we want to be able to take into account certain realities. Not everyone has the same type of networks available. If you're in a rural area, you may or may not have cellular, probably not, and certainly not 5G. And if you're in an urban area, you may have more facilities. So there may be a mix of satellites or a mix of cellular networks. How we take action on that is really about how we structure that. In the case of no matter what network you have, there are certain realities we know. You need to be able to get on it. You need to have access, service delivery, a way to maintain your network and make sure it stays up. And of course, to be able to have interoperability of some sort. And we want to set the stage so that we can have deployments or implementation later on. So I know the group is primarily looking at different areas of specialization, including IoT type of capabilities. But what we want to look at as well is to see how does one type of capability interact with another. So there are different use cases and different rates that are defined for 5G on the right-hand side. And we can take this and be able to take action on it as far as how we provision it based on how we define a network component. So loosely speaking, if we look at breaking up any network into an access, such as how do we gain access to the network? If we look at it from a service delivery point of view, how do we provide service? So in this case, we may look at edge capabilities, for example. From a network operations and customer management point of view, we're looking at it primarily from looking at different ways of perhaps looking at network configurations, APIs, being able to make sure that the network's up and running, making sure there's a call accounting for billing capabilities, And of course, be able to use, at some point, you will reach the limit of your particular network, and you may want to use someone else's network. So in the case of roaming, for example, moving to another area, or maybe to a different type of scenario, such as using a public safety specific network, for example, with land mobile radio. So we're looking at interoperability in that case as well. So how this will look like in a purely architectural point of view is shown here. We won't get into the details here, but if you're, for example, is primarily looking at IoT and LTE, that's shown in the yellow area. If you're looking for a 5G perspective, that's shown in the larger picture in blue. And of course, the most level of customization for our networks is going to be in the access components area. So depending on how we want to look at it from any of our use cases, whether we're looking at it also from urban and suburban and rural point of view, we want to be able to take this into account and be able to use this within our transdisciplinary framework. And of course, 5G has some other capabilities. Probably the most familiar is network slicing, but there are a lot of other areas, including critical medical applications, EV2X and UAV and so on. So the last part of it is for the transdisciplinary framework is we know we have a way of defining our needs or demand, and that's from the ecosystem. We know we can look at it from our capabilities point of view, and that comes from our networking point of view perspective. So now comes the question, what do we do with it? And that's really where governance function comes into play. So we can look at it into three different areas. We can look at it long-term or in a strategic view, where we are looking at could be any type of long-term goals you may have that are called out on the yellow box on the lower left-hand side. So it may be digital literacy, access and inclusion, trust, privacy, and security, policy development and data model governance, and a whole host of different activities that actually will help in the long run. There are tactical functions, and I'm sure we're familiar with some of the responses related to COVID-19, but they may be related to disasters or hurricanes or what have you, and may also include pilot programs. And of course, from an operations point of view, for governance, we want to make sure that all of these functions are working the way it should be working. So it could be as basic as our buses and trains running on time. So when we're looking at operations KPIs here, it's not necessarily the type of KPIs we're looking at from a networking point of view per se. This is really more from a governance perspective to see our basic services being met. And at the end, we want to be able to put that back into our consideration as we traverse through looking at our strategy, making sure that we are able to prioritize our needs and to be able to take action and deploy different capabilities and measure how are we doing, and so on. So we can continue that cycle. So the bottom line is, it really doesn't matter what your particular individual background may be. There is a method for you to be able to use a particular transdisciplinary framework to be able to engage with others. And this is the benefit of such a framework as this. It allows you, no matter what your background is, to be able to take action into some long-term view in a sustainable and a structured way, so that there is a method for you to be able to engage. It's also flexible for your particular needs. So any two cities, so for example, in the local area, whether we're looking at Washington, DC and Baltimore or Richmond, and we can go further on out, they have different needs, they have different priorities, they have different capabilities. So we want to be sensitive to that. And of course, as we go through and we extend this even to rural communities, you will see there's quite a range. So we want to have a framework that adjusts to all of these different types of capabilities. So the links at the bottom that you see there are more for if you wanted to read, for example, a working group chapter, applications and services. And there's also a 1-hour webinar link there if this is something you'd also want to look at to find out more information. So at this point, if you were to go to the applications and services chapter, you will see, for example, there are about 8 ecosystems we've tackled, and we've developed certain scenarios, some of which we'll be discussing here. And we have future work that we want to expand upon this and look at different ecosystems in more detail, as you see at the top. As far as looking at the different technologies, where we certainly want to look at 5G advanced. and of course 6G in whatever flavor it eventually turns out to be. We want to also take that into account. So there are different capabilities that you see, different form factors, different deployment drivers, which we briefly touched on earlier. And of course, reduced capability devices, especially if you're looking at IoT needs. We want to look at that and take that into account from the technology perspective. And of course, from governance, we want to be able to deepen the alignment. And 6G and 5G Advanced is also looking at that as well. So that's really the background for the transdisciplinary framework, what it intends to have, how it is structured, and the value that it provides from different stakeholders. So I will pause briefly if there's any questions. If not, sorry, I see there's some chat sessions. If not,
I have a question. Hi, thank you for a great presentation, Mr. Narendra. And I'm not from, as you know, technology expert here, especially with the networks, but my question is about blockchain network that's decentralized one, as you know. Is it it can be done here with such network framework, especially we are talking about transdisciplinary framework, or it's something need another infrastructure framework if we say it. That's my question.
Thank you. And that's a great question, actually. So for blockchain, I will put that in the category of artificial intelligence, machine language, and security, position determination, and a whole host of different technologies and enablers that really transcend the key network components that we discussed. So for example, in agriculture, we'll see later on, blockchain will be used across the board. We call it out in certain areas, but they are very much capable of being used in each stage of the different components. So it's not only component specific, but there are certain functions like that, like blockchain, that applies across the board.
So this is Don. Is it fair to say, Narendra, that blockchain could be used as an enabling technology for functions within the network operations, such as billing and the mediation layer, call detail records, things like that? And it could also be used in a financial service or other industry as a payload that sits on top of this network, uses the network to carry the messages.
Yes, that is definitely fair to say, because it does look at each one of these different areas. And case in point is agriculture, as we're looking at different areas that you're having different types of produce. How do you validate and how do you ensure that you're able to have, you have that level of authentication there that it enables? So blockchain is definitely useful there, but it can be used also in the access stage as well.
And then to tie it back into your chart, things like healthcare, where there might be an IoT device that's doing patient monitoring, patient attributes, patient testing, that could also be enabled or enhanced by some blockchain use.
That is absolutely correct. And generally speaking, any end user devices like that for any of the ecosystems. So whether we're looking at healthcare, agriculture, public safety, if we're having different types of devices there, blockchain has a role there as well.
So Narendra, this is Michael Novak. How are you today?
Doing well, Michael. How are you?
Good. So I appreciate this. This is great. I like the transdisciplinary approach because, well, that's sort of what I focus on. One of the terms that I didn't hear come up has to do with the ability to work offline. You know, you talk about the network, and we talked about, yes, the network has different variations based on its capabilities. Have you considered the situations where, you know, again, a FEMA situation, something's happened, everything is down, but we still need these IoT devices and we need these operations to continue until the network is able to come back up?
Yes, and that is definitely one of the use cases for public safety that we'll touch on. Generally speaking, I mean, we won't get into all of the details, but yes, those are certain cases for emergencies and non-emergencies. So in a remote area, for example, you may have markets requiring minimal service level, as you see in the lower left-hand side, the second to last bullet. So there are different areas that we wanted to be able to look at it depending on its particular application. And that's where context comes in. So in this case, for when a network is down, there are many ways we can look at this. We can look at deployables for emergencies. And if you are truly isolated, then you will look at different ways to be able to sustain operations for it. But the whole approach to that would be really contextualizing the need for those particular cases. And that's why we are looking at breaking it up into the different stages for that. So when we get to the public safety, you'll see that it's broken up actually based on FEMA's structure.
Yeah, I was also thinking about just from a structural perspective as well, that if I go into a government facility where they say you have to take out all electronic devices, I would still maybe want to have access again to the services, even though I don't have access to the network outside. Right.
So that comes into the devices or the network you happen to be connected to within that particular facility. So, you know, it really depends if you're accessing an internal building network or a private network of sorts. Now that's really more of a network operations issue as far as.
Yeah, but I was thinking about a standalone as well, where again, I might be in a facility where I need access off of my device, or maybe, you know, Dawn's and my device right here, right now, but I don't have the permissions to log into the network in the location where I'm physically at. Or, you know, again, I could be on a ship somewhere in the middle of somewhere where I don't have immediate access. I was just curious if that had been taken into consideration. And it sounds like it has, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is actually not even related to the overall picture. This is really more about operations and being able to, it's really more in the line of deployment. Are you able to access the network? And it sounds like you are. The question now is the permission to be able to access different sources. So that goes back into actually, to be more specific, to zero in on this, it really comes back to the network operations and customer management part of it. What do you have permission to use? What don't you have permission to use? If it's a matter of you being in a ship and being able to access your home office somewhere else, there is a matter of you going through it, you're using some sort of wireless capability, whether it's satellite and cellular. Now we're going into the network extensions part of it. Are you using the public internet, or are you using some sort of enterprise to mobile connectivity method? Either way, we're looking at a network extensions functionality. And that's already been taken care of in a lot of the cellular standards, but not all standards would have that. So in the case of different types of technologies, they may or may not be defined.
And a related question, Narendra, for LoRa networks, sometimes we are, some companies are using it on deserts and as you see, also in the middle of oceans or something. Is it something could be happen also in the 5G, or there are no frequency for LoRa network inside this transdisciplinary framework, if I may ask?
Sure. So there's two things here, right? So there is the technology. So the transdisciplinary framework does not matter. It does not take into account what type of technology you have. So we are kind of agnostic. So if it's 5G or non-5G, it really doesn't matter, as long as we're able to utilize that to be able to implement any kind of solution we want. As far as the spectrum is related, if we're using Wi-Fi, then 5G has the ability to use that as well. So we can use that as from a spectrum point of view. From a LoRa point of view, it's a matter of how we connect it to it. So a lot of that is actually taken care of by the standards, depending on the way you want to do that, what type of interworking functions you may have. And we will see shortly as we go towards the different ways of implementing it. And that's where I'm headed to at this point. I will show you ways to be able to do that and when we get to that conceptual map. Okay, so good question so far. So thank you. If you are putting some information in the chat, I will try my best to read it as we go through it. But please feel free to ask me as we go. At this point, I'd like to just kind of extend a bit more towards some of the applications and services we're looking at. So this is really more about, we kind of have an idea about the transdisciplinary framework. It's not necessarily to redefine any of the 5G standards, 4G standards, or so on. It's to use them as it is, or if it's other types of standards, whether it's LoRa or any other satellite providers, for example, may have their own standards at this point. We want to be able to use that as we move forward. So how do we use the transdisciplinary framework and take advantage of that? Well, part of that is we want to be able to traverse within an ecosystem and across ecosystems. And here's an example of such a case using transportation. So here's a map of Washington, D.C. You see on the left-hand side some traffic lights. You see in the blue lines rail tracks. So most cities would have some sort of multimodal communication capabilities or intermodal, where we're looking at road-based travel, rail, water, or air. And for those cities to be able to function, at least from a transportation point of view, today they are wrestling with ways to cope with congestion management, to move traffic along, to at least make sure there's a normal flow for efficient communications and for physical mobility as well as it relates to transportation. So there's traffic management systems at work to be able to do so, and that's happening today. As we look at this and say, well, there are certain trends that we've noticed with COVID. There's a lot of needs for pedestrian-only traffic in city centers, for example. What do we do with that? Do we have enough parking capabilities, or do we want to do something with our parking capabilities at this point if we are to go to pedestrian-friendly environment? So if we want to look at this in the long view, we might say, for example, we're leaning more towards autonomous vehicles or connected vehicles. And if that's the case, that may include other capabilities we didn't really consider before. And that is, if I have a connected vehicle that can take me to a point in the middle of a city, it doesn't need to have a parking spot. It drops me off, it goes and it gets recharged somewhere else if it's an electric vehicle. And it doesn't even have to be in the middle of the city. It can go somewhere where it's less congested. So now it stands to reason that I do not need as many parking spots as I had before. So I can start making a phase for that to be able to have access to the different buildings, to be able to have, in the short term, make sure that there's enough parking facilities there. But in the long term, I can look at this and say, well, at some point I want to remove that because I will not need that. So I can have a phased approach. And for the long-term view, we can look at this to see, for example, these spots that we can look at for parking. If it's a facility, can we repurpose it for additional housing, for example? Or can we use, even if it's an empty lot, can we use it for a mini park or maybe a small commercial entity or something to that effect? It provides a long-term view just by looking at transportation and real estate. That's the only two areas that we're considering right now for this particular example.
And just to emphasize that point, I saw a study where somebody had talked about the idea of extending out a restaurant or a cafe out into what was previously a parking spot. They could get 8 or 10 more tables in, increase their revenue pretty dramatically, and make that specific property more valuable.
Exactly, yes. And this is becoming more and more popular. In fact, cities were headed that way anyways, but COVID kind of accelerated that because now most of us are now used to it, and I've seen it and I've experienced on-street dining. So yes, I mean, this is becoming more and more popular. So thank you for that, Don.
But if you have a meeting with any of the DC city planners, don't give them the idea that there are too many parking spots in DC today.
No, that would be a long-term.
There's a shortage.
Yes, and that's the middle point to make sure that we have enough parking spots. But in the long-term view, if once we get to the point where we have connected vehicle and they're prevalent and they're electrified, for example, you don't really need to have vehicles there with you. You just need them to get you there and get you back. But that's down the road.
And we haven't heard from Kat or Danielle, who are on one of the federal working groups. Any thoughts or comments? Just put in the chat if you get a chance.
Hi, this is
So-
Mike Cannon
Hi.
from Stafford County. Oh, sorry. Go ahead if you.
No, I was just going to comment on Michael's response about the pop-up shops. Yes.
I think, Kat, you came off mute.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. No, I don't want to interrupt. I was going to say I have no comments. I'm really just listening and learning and absorbing at this time. Thanks, Don.
Glad you're here. Thanks.
I was just gonna, this is Mike Cannon from Stafford County. So I'm one of the non-federal folks here on the local government side. Curious if you've kind of considered these intelligent transportation systems with respect to like bridges and other areas where there will be sensors, and how the auto manufacturers are really slow to adapt to accommodating that. I think Audi is probably the only major manufacturer that I'm aware of that has kind of embraced this kind of connectivity.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that area. As it is right now, just for road-based traffic, that transportation, there's still a lot of work even with that, and that's probably the most advanced at this point. So for looking at different crossing points, as far as whether we're looking at rail to roads and you know, we're looking at drawbridges and so on, there's different types of roadside devices, trackside devices, and so on that needs to be implemented. So, but it's not only about the technology there. We have to make sure that the networks are there also to be able to have that connected vehicles. And that goes back to the overarching enhanced connected vehicles capabilities that 5G is looking at this point. So a lot has been done, but still a lot more to be done within the road-based traffic, road-based transportation, as opposed to the intermodal type of communications that we need. So
Right.
that will be part of the vehicle to infrastructure capabilities.
Right, great. And I guess just adding to that, you know, the idea of having sensors on a bridge is, you know, the bridge freezes, it immediately notifies the vehicles that there's a ice condition and, you know, may force them to slow down, as an example.
And the same goes for roadways too, with icing, black ice, for example. So thank you for the comments so far. So now we're going to step it up a little bit more. We spoke about transdisciplinary framework. We spoke about the interaction of two ecosystems. Now we're going to take one, healthcare, for example, and look at this as far as how do we apply it and be able to work with a transdisciplinary framework towards healthcare. So as you may recall, healthcare is really about a continuum of care from birth to end of life care. We've broken it up into the different stages at the top. Conceptually, if you were to look at this on a global scale, and that's what we do in the Telehealth Industry Connections Group, we can see that, for example, there is a basic need for the tele portion of telehealth, and that it has to do with the connectivity and accessibility. And you see that in the green, the shades of green for the global view for in-country penetration rates. The blue dots primarily represent points of delivery, and it doesn't have to be a hospital. If you are, for example, a pharmacy, you would qualify. And you will see those blue dots here. And one thing you will notice, there's a lot of blue dots, but there's some areas where there aren't any. And of course, the city centers are shown in either blue or tanned or brown, depending on your monitor. So the convergence of all of these areas is really what we're looking at as far as the ability to have a point of care for healthcare there. And the areas where they are lacking, we're also looking at that primarily for at least for the minimum set for remote monitoring services. At some point, we want to be able for you to have access to a physical facility if you need to have that. And there's different works that the telehealth group is looking at, such as hospital at home, to try to kind of mitigate some of these issues. But at this point, if there is something very serious, you are probably going to need to go to a full-fledged hospital. So we look at this again with the same idea. We've broken it up as mentioned. We've looked at this as far as saying, well, we want to be able to look at this from access, service delivery, operations and service management, and interoperability. So how do we do that? So this example here is shown for the remote monitoring services. And very recently, the telehealth group actually conducted an RPM, a remote patient monitoring competition. And there were a lot of different types of functions and solutions that were actually provided within the competition. And they're far-ranging, actually. Wearables for workforce, to looking at skin diseases, to rehabilitation for, capabilities, and so on. So on the left, we won't get into a lot of the detail, but it's essentially, we take this as far as the different capabilities of what we want to have from a networking point of view. So at this point, we're not really looking at, say, we have cellular, what can we do with it? We're defining the problems such as, for remote patient monitoring, what are we really trying to do? Or for any remote monitoring services, how do we want to be able to have access to it? So obviously questions about spectrum and devices, and as far as different types of sensors would come to play here. Then it's a matter of service delivery. How do we gain access to this? Do we need a third-party provider? Do we look directly at your local provider or a hospital? So these are the type of questions that we want to have. And in the case of patient and provider operations management, that's basically network and customer management. What a service provider would do, we're looking at this from a healthcare provider. So how do we make this more interoperable? And of course, at this point, we're looking at questions that come up with health records and looking at whether we want to use standardized devices or whether we want to use standardized types of record management systems such as FHIR. And of course, we want to be able to hand off along the way. So as we traverse from a remote patient monitoring services, so a scenario could be, I'm being monitored, life is good, I have no problems, and all of a sudden there's an issue. Someone contacts me and says, you need to go to the hospital right away. And I may respond, I'm not able to drive myself there. In which case an ambulance is coming to see you. If that is the case, what sort of measurements are being used from your remote device to the ambulance to the hospital that you're going to be taken to? How do we make that work? So we want to be able to look at this from an interoperability point of view. And of course, in the background, there is a networking capabilities that we need to be cognitive about. So for the governance part of it, we want to ask ourselves as far as what type of services, how do we increase the different types of services, and we can have a whole host of different sets of conversations along that area. And when we're done with remote monitoring services, we can move on to the other stages. But this is essentially the approach for it. So there was a question.
Quick question.
Sure.
So do you see zero trust frameworks as being on a collision course with some of these techniques, or do they complement it?
Well, I mean, they would complement it. At this point, it's a matter of the different types of facilities that you have and the different types of providers that you have. So the zero trust would come into play when you have the devices and you're taking the measurements. How do you authenticate to your end provider? Because at some point you want to make sure that you're not being spoofed either. So zero trust would have a role across the board. Security would have a role across the board. Same as the conversation we had before with blockchain and AI/ML.
Gotcha, thank you.
So Narendra, one other question to that point. Looking at this slide, I see it focused on, the patient to their healthcare provider or someone in the healthcare industry, so to speak. Are you considering also dealing with the payers or the insurance side?
Definitely. And in fact, the critical medical applications do recognize that there are payers involved in this. And that's from the 3GPP specs. But yes, if you see at the bottom there, it says third-party engagements, including payers and equipments. So they do have a role in there. So part of the transdisciplinary framework is not really to go and to reinvent, for example, the relationships within any particular ecosystem. It basically takes it as it is. And how that is used from one place to another or another country from one country to another may be very different. So we want to be able to take whatever state that particular ecosystem happens to be and be able to integrate it to the fullest capability with other ecosystems at their current level of performance. So that's really what the intent is. Okay, so hopefully I've answered that question. And there was another question about LoRaWAN. And this is basically, I didn't want to get into the details. I mean, if we wanted to go for as far as the specific details for 5G, we would be looking at a architecture such as this, and we can look as far as the connectivity, as far as whether we're looking at roaming or we're looking at some sort of internet connectivity for with the LoRaWAN system. So this is at the top level, it's really more about enterprise to mobile communications or mobile to mobile communications. On the other hand, we could be connecting to other types of networks, including fixed networks. So either case is possible, but I wanted to shift this, and I'm shifting back to this particular slide here. You do not have as much detail, but it's implied. And that is essentially, you will see some of the remnants for the access capabilities with cellular towers and so on. And as it hits that blue cloud where you see mobile data network, that's essentially the connectivity part that you'll be able to look at the interconnections among different facilities, whether it's fixed or whether it's using a cellular network or satellite network or any other type of network. And we can look at this as far as from a conceptual transdisciplinary view, where we have our particular needs, and that's what you're seeing in the blue clouds. That's essentially your ecosystems. That is your healthcare ecosystem. So whatever standard or whatever method that you're using for both rural healthcare or urban healthcare, and where your facilities are and what type of networks you have, they are all shown in that blue clouds, and there may be specific technologies that are associated with that, such as EHRs. That's also part of the blue clouds. The network of networks approach comes into looking at the connectivity and accessibility perspective primarily, where we're looking at 5G and future networks, but it also can apply for other types of networks where we're looking at network technology convergence at the top. On the periphery are really the governance aspect. So we're looking at increasing the depth or with the reach of healthcare. So what sort of governance functions are needed for that? And how do you go about doing that? So those are conversations you would be able to have for healthcare by looking at the periphery for governance. So depending on your background, you can jump right into the technology area, or you can go from the ecosystems area or the governance approach. And we will see that repeated again in public safety shortly. But I also wanted to take the opportunity to show that even with the recent COVID-19, and these are some of the earlier stages when we were getting all of our COVID-19 cases, you will see it's not necessarily random. There is a method to it. So as you can see from the beginning in March, there were certain cities that really we started to see a lot of COVID-19 cases. In the background where you see the roadways, that's actually a very static model for vehicular traffic density. So this is not even 2020 road density. This is looking at earlier trends in traffic to say, well, these are the most, these highways are mostly traveled. The darker it is, the chances are you will see a lot more traffic on it. And of course, the different clusters shows you the different population areas. So by just looking at population and average vehicular traffic density and the COVID-19 cases, you can see a clear trend of how the cases are actually, how COVID-19 is actually coming across for the continental US. Of course, the air traffic is not modeled here. So as new cities, you have air traffic and you have different infections coming in because of air travel, that city basically starts to see a rise in COVID-19 cases. But the main point here is that by looking at a transdisciplinary approach, by looking not only at healthcare, but looking at the additional ecosystems such as transportation, and we can look at building density and population density and the different modes of transportation, and we can sort of predict where it's going to be headed towards. So if you wanted to take a look at that, you can certainly look at applications and services, as well as there's a public safety task force white paper that goes into this in a lot more detail, including a local view for Washington, DC. But in the interest of time, we'll move on to at least for how we can look at this also from public safety point of view. And there were some questions about FEMA. So as you can see here, one thing I want to call out immediately is the mission areas that you see, prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery, that is directly from FEMA mission areas defined in their emergency response, or sorry, in their emergency frameworks. So the disaster planning frameworks that they have, they've discussed all of these different areas. What we have done is say, okay, it's very well defined, including emergency support functions and recovery support functions. There's actually follow-on work that has to do with looking at different periods. How do you classify different types of incidents? So there's incident classification, there's command structure, and so on. And that is all fantastic. So what we did is say, let's take that and build upon it and use our technology focus here and bring that into the picture where we can look at what some of the work that's been defined, including emergency operations centers, to be able to use that common vocabulary and capability among the public safety professionals, and to implement the transdisciplinary framework using that approach. So we still can look at public safety networks from a land mobile point of view, land mobile radio or LMR, or from FirstNet point of view, from a cellular point of view. And we can use the same view where we have technology convergence. We're looking at the outer peripheries for governance, whether we're looking at response. And no matter how you classify an incident, whether it's a type 1 through type 5, it comes down to operational periods, any type of resources that are needed on scene, and the geographical area. So that actually are buzzwords from a technology point of view, where we can say, wow, that actually translates almost directly to service area, to capacity requirements, and of course, the quality of experience that is going to be needed to be able to respond to these areas. So we can actually take that almost immediately as it is and run with that. And a lot of these works are actually documented in the applications and services chapter, as well as the white paper. And you can see some of the different areas. This is also available for download. And I do want to bring to your attention, if you are available next week in the local area, there's in Laurel, Maryland, we have the 5G tactical and first responder conference or workshop, followed by the public safety technology, the technology initiative that will be holding another workshop on the 8th. So it's about a 1.5 day event if you're in the area. It is in person, but it is free as well for you to attend. So that's essentially the view from public safety. So in the remaining time, I just wanted to kind of briefly go over, now that you're a little more familiar with transdisciplinary framework, you kind of have a good idea at this point how they relate to each other for ecosystems. Well, urban and rural communities are really a roll-up of all of these different ecosystems. We're no longer focusing on public safety or healthcare or transportation. It's all of the above. So, but we do need to call out what exactly we're looking at. So cities and rural areas or rural communities, they're very dynamic. So there are a lot of ecosystems that are interconnected, more so in an urban area, but also we need to understand and recognize that there's a lot of trade-offs and a lot of considerations for both areas. If you were to look at it, for example, in a city environment, we can break it up into different vulnerability areas to see what areas require more immediate attention in a particular area of interest. So for example, if we have an emergency that, such as a public safety disaster scene where we're expecting a large hurricane or tornado or something that requires people to vacate or evacuate, we probably want to look at those areas that are more vulnerable to transportation. So that would be one area to be able to look at this. And there is a follow-on description of this as it relates to COVID-19 in the Public Safety Task Force white paper that was mentioned earlier. But essentially what we want to do is to recognize not only do we have to deal with these areas, but there's also a more direct need for governance as it relates to social vulnerabilities. For challenges, there's the usual suspects. There's a lot of projects that need to be done, and there's probably not enough funding. So how do we make sure that we're looking at the project funding pipeline? There's a matter of trust, privacy, and security in some cases. There's been a lot of work that has been done and without these areas necessarily being addressed, and work has subsequently stopped. So we need to at least be able to at least address that in that particular area as it relates to a particular jurisdiction. And of course, we want to take into account the different priorities, sustainability, sensitivities, different types of standards, and data models that are needed. For the enablers, we want to be able to make sure there's connectivity and accessibility. That is the primary goal here, to make sure that is the minimum requirement. If we do not have that, there's not much more we can do. We want to be able to look at different layers of security. We want to look at different needs-based positioning, different digital twins as enablers, contextual data models, AI/ML, blockchain, and a whole host of different areas that come into play that will also act as enablers. So we are working on this in the P1950 as far as it relates to defining the standards for that, and that's a work that's ongoing. And that primarily addresses the ecosystem as far as from the combined ecosystems as it relates to urban areas. So for rural areas, this map shows you two things. It shows you basically that we have developed a lot of different capabilities very quickly. Within a short 20-year span, there's a lot of connectivity capabilities we have for a lot of different areas. And in some areas, we do not. So work has been done very quickly, but there are some ecosystems that have been around for a lot longer, such as agriculture. And they have always embraced technology, but in this case of agriculture, may not have a lot of access. So while the US may have a single data point that says it has a high level of connectivity, if you were to look closer, you will see it varies. I wouldn't necessarily get into the numbers that you see on the right-hand side, but the takeaway here is not everyone in the continental US has the same level of connectivity. Some areas may have an excess capability, and in some areas in the white spaces, especially in the Western states, there's probably none. So it varies. So a lot of areas such as agriculture, for example, is a good way, a good jumping off point for rural communications, because for us to take care of or address our agriculture needs, we want to be able to have these basic requirements for large capacity networks, because if we're tracking a lot of these data, especially from crops, we will need a high capacity network. It has to be symmetrical, it has to be reliable, scalable, and of course, secure. And the same question that applied before with zero trust would apply here as well for security aspects. And of course, there's a large investment needed for that. A lot of this coming from the FCC task force. So what we want to do in the agriculture is really to say, great, we recognize agriculture is important, especially as we're looking at climate resiliency. And we want to look at this from a food supply chain to address agriculture primarily, but it's a good jumping off point for rural development. So without getting into the details of food supply chain, I mean, bear in mind that depending on how we break this up, and we've broken it up into those 5 areas that you see there are different capabilities and different networking requirements to be able to meet those particular needs. But this is not our focus for this particular discussion. We are actually looking more about transdisciplinary framework for rural development. So what we understand is, if we are able to provide the capabilities to satisfy the needs for the food supply chain, we can take those capabilities and add additional capabilities to be able to address the needs of the local communities, for not only for agriculture, but for education, for healthcare, for banking needs, and a whole host of other basic services. But we also have to take care of any of the challenges related to communications and local infrastructure. But the idea is, if we address agriculture, and even if we look primarily from the food supply chain, it's a great launching point for the rest of the rural development needs. So there's a white paper in progress, and I hope we will be able to deliver this by the ending of the year, and it should be, it's in the final edits. But if you're interested in this particular area, that's also upcoming as well. So the idea here with the transdisciplinary framework, you've seen some examples, and that is they're aligned, and we have a number of programs that are linked together. So it's not separate programs in their own silos. They are actually linked together, and we have now, by addressing these areas, we now have a means to traverse from one area to the other. And that's essentially the main takeaway for the transdisciplinary framework, is that it gives you a method that is structured, but also flexible, and it caters to your local needs. It can be addressed, you can use it to address individual ecosystems or a group of ecosystems, whether they're in a smart city or rural development environment. And of course, we can use this to identify challenges, opportunities, and address economies of scale and scope. And hopefully, yeah, I have 2 minutes to spare. So if there's any additional questions you may have, I thank you for speaking. And if you have any questions, let me know, please.
I want to be the first to really thank you. This was just fantastic. A lot of information, great authoritative sources. Clearly you shared a lot of knowledge with us today. There were sessions recorded, which I'm thankful for, because I think some other people are going to want to, go through this and perhaps have some follow-on questions with you. Once again, thanks so much. I'll go ahead and close it out since we're out of time, but really, this was wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We'll see everyone next month. And, the program is yet to be announced. So we're working on a couple of things. Talk to you all soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.